So yes, so we're back. We're still in this sugya. The thing is, we're learning a what's considered a halakhic response, right? It's not a pasak; it's a response in terms of issues that are going on and giving a perspective, right? You kind of derive from it, as you want. But we've been learning a tshuva responsa written by a Rabbi Yehuda Blake. Sorry if I say his name incorrectly, but he's a rabbi in North America. But he wrote a series of different responses to various contemporary topics. One of which halakhic issues. One of which is we learned earlier, like maybe a couple months ago, on preemptive war. How does the Torah look at preemptive war? Based off everything that's going on here in Israel, and what's the halakhic outlook on it, right? So we we went into that. We also studied Rabbi Blake's outlook also on teaching Torah to non-Jews, and what's the halakhic outlook, what's the history been. It's very interesting. But now we're dealing with veganism, right? And veganism is an important thing to talk about right now because we have to be, the learning that we do has to be in touch with what we're going through in life, right? And so right now, we just got finished going through one of the most important spiritual experiences we're going to have, maybe in our life, for sure this year, right? Which is Pesach. And the Pesach is like kind of like the launching path into this new world of Kedusha, right? We enter this new world, Rosh Chodesh Nisan. We enter this new reality of Kedusha, a new cycle of it, on Rosh Chodesh, which is a new year, and it's a Shana Tova, right? It's the beginning of the year. It's the beginning of having a great year, right? And so part of that process, especially with the students and learning, is to really go into that place of new beginning. So I thought it would be very nice to talk about, the outlook on veganism. And the reason why is because veganism itself is such a big part of the inception of humanity, right? In terms of the eating and man's eating and the context of it. But not just that, but also the idea of dealing with, how do we deal with contemporary issues? Now that we came out of the teva of sorts, right? We now have to deal with this new world, and we have to deal with all these new things, and how do we deal with, how do we address that? And that's what the Omer is about, right? It's about being in that place of having that spiritual download revealed, that download that we received from Pesach revealed, right? And so we just want to go through that process of evolution and how we got there. So we've started the first part, and I think we should be able to finish the second part maybe in this conversation, maybe not. But the first part of the conversation was introducing the various Rabbi Black brought different, just different historical narratives, on the history of the relationship of veganism or plant-based diets and how they've existed at different periods of time. But the main inyan, the main idea that came out of it was this idea of understanding that people eating a plant-based diet is not, it's not against Judaism, right? It's not like something that we aspire to do, although there are people for health reasons and different reasons that people do it. Some people had issues with, different times in history. Jews had issues with how the meat was slaughtered and if it was kosher or not, so they just chose to stay away from it, focus more on things like fish, right? So there's been different experiences that have happened throughout history on that, and we touched on that. But but the main idea is, the writer of this tshuva brings out this concept of Kain and Hevel, right? And that concept and the way it's explained in this responsa it's miraculous, right? Because it shows this two different worldviews. As we know that we talked about this before, but in this context, it's even, I think, even more clear in some ways, right? So we talk about the sacrifices. Interesting enough, the sacrifice that is talked about with Chaim and Hevel, according to the Midrashim, happened on Pesach, right? This is Pesach, right? This is the beginning. It's the 14th. Hashem comes to, that Adam sees in the book of the book of Adam, I guess, given to him by the angel Razel, comes in with all the spiritual technology of how the universe works. And so Adam tells his sons to bring a sacrifice on this day and you'll be blessed. So Cain brings, basically things from the vegetation world. And Hevel brings this concept of from the animal world. And so the worldview was like this. And this is where the concept of veganism. The worldview says that Cain understood reality as everything was one, everything was connected, which is a very lofty thought. But there was no structural dynamic in terms of the order of creation. And he saw everything as the same. So he saw it as being improper to bring an animal as a sacrifice, right? Animals being, most like a human, right? And so, but he did see a separation with the vegetation kingdom, right? So he brought that, right? As where Hevel saw that, no, the animals were beneath man. And man, based off of the way that, him herding and seeing how nature was, is that man has an authority over, man has an authority over, over animals and the plants and the rock kingdom. He saw that order, right? Now, both of their, according to the sages, both of their understandings was not correct. As where Hevel saw that an animal could be sacrificed for God, but not necessarily sacrificed for his benefit, right? That he could actually eat it and devour it as a ruler above it, right? So his perception wasn't clear, but it was not as erroneous as the language used in the responsa as Cain, which he saw everything as the same. Now the problem with that is that after the sacrifice happened, and Cain saw that his brother Hevel sacrificed. And interesting enough, Hevel brought a lamb, right? So when we bring a lamb on Pesach, we could say, oh, well, the lamb was a god type figure for the Egyptians, and we had to check it. But now when we're thinking about it, now we're going back to the beginning of creation with Hevel, right? He also sacrificed the lamb on the same exact day, right? Just thousands of years before, right? So maybe we could kind of look at that. I don't want to go into that world because that's a new reality, right? That's a new reality when we go into the shechting of the lamb and we're connecting that to the Hevel in the dynamic of Hevel and this whole mechanism of the lamb and this whole thing, what it represents. But the point is like this. So Cain saw that his sacrifice was not accepted, but his brother's was, right? So how do you understand that? He didn't change his worldview. He just understood that if you sacrifice an animal, God would accept it more than he would a plant, right? Because it meant more to God, right? But he didn't understand it as the order of creation. He just thought it as like this creator force. Just he liked him out. Like he rather have vanilla ice cream versus a strawberry ice cream. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just a preference. It had nothing to do with a structural order of reality, that's where Hevel's premise was. And so because of that premise that Cain had, that God preferred this, he also was able to take that thinking and justify the killing of his brother. Because it wasn't about order. It was just about, okay, well, if this could die, I thought this was similar by us. We're all the same. Okay, so what's the difference between me killing a man? And so that is the issue that comes from the sages bring out about the concept of veganism. The issue isn't the eating of the food, it's the perception that animal and human are the same. And it's the perception that we need to treat animals a specific way because man, it's cruel to kill an animal. right? And that's the issue over here. So we went through that part. So now we're going to go even further, and we're going to bring a rabbi that we've been learning from in this year, Rabbi Kook. And so Rabbi Kook has a very interesting perspective because he talks about veganism in the frame of the Messianic times and going and saying how this is an ideal, right? And so this is a short conversation about that. And it's very possibly after that, we're going to go into meat and Yom Tov, right? Because there are certain Yom Tov even that speak specifically about Basar and the role of Basar. So we're going to go into that too, but we're going to start with Rabbi Kook, and then we're going to, God willing, go into this dynamic of Basar into hold on, and how that plays a role on Yom Tov, which is a big thing, right? Okay, let's go. All right. Okay, so we read this paragraph in the last class, but I'm specifically focusing on Rav Kook in this way in terms of the heading of the class. But it says like this: Rav Kook, please be with us. Okay, so it says like this: one modern day scholar who often cites as looking upon veganism as with extreme favor is Rabbi Abraham Kook. Who's the first Ashkenaz chief rabbi of Israel and humongous person. And we're reading actually his essay on prayer right now. He says, it is indeed the case that the writings of Rabbi Kook speak of veganism as an ideal point to the fact that Adam did not partake in the flesh of animals. In the context, however, Rav Kook makes those comments as a portrayal of a Messianic era. He regards man's moral state in that the period as being akin to of Adam before the sin, and does indeed view reunification of enjoyment of animal flesh as part of the heightened moral awareness which will be manifest at the time. But Rav Kook is empathetic, nay, and vehement in astonishing that veganism dare not be adopted as a norm of human contact prior to the advent of this era. He says, this Messianic type era, he uses a different word, it just kind of messes me up. Rabbi Kook advances what are, in effect, four distinct arguments in the reunification of veganism as a goal towards which contemporary man ought to aspire. He says like this: addressing himself as a member of a veganism movement, Rav Kook remarks almost, so he's speaking to fallaciously, right? Almost fallaciously, that he's speaking to a vegan movement. He says that it might surprise that all of the problems of human welfare have been resolved and solved. Remaining areas of concern is human animal welfare. In effect, his argument is that it ought to be proper order, priority. So he's speaking to a vegan group, and he's basically saying that, we have a lot of problems as humanity, you know what I mean? So he said, Rav Kook is quite explicit in stating that the enmity between nation and radical discrimination, or sorry, between nations and racial discrimination should be greater of moral concern than mankind's well-being of animals, and that the only when such matters can be rectified should the attention be turned to questions of animal welfare. So his position to start off with is a position of saying like, hey, veganism is important. It's an idea we should do, but we should not overlook the issues between man and how we treat each other. We should not prioritize. And this goes back to the kind issue, right? The kind issue of kind seeing animals at the same level as humans, right? Which is a distortion of the system. Given the present nature of the human conditions, present condition maintains Rabbi Kook, it is impossible for man to get rid of his. He says, okay, so he says Rabbi Kook maintains it's impossible for man to sublime or to get rid of his desire for meat. The inequivocal result of promoting veganism as a normative standards of human contact, argues Rabbi Kook, will be that man will violate this norm in seeking self-gratification. Once taking the life of an animal is regarded as equal and abhorrent to taking the life of a man, it will transpire, contends Rav Kook, that that in his pursuit of meat, men will regard cannibalism as no more heinous than the consumption of animal flesh. And the result will be not enhanced, respected, not enhance respect for the life of animals, but rather the disbasement of human life. So again, this goes back to the concept with Cain, right? Because they said after what happened with the consciousness of Cain did not leave this world, right? It was never corrected, right? That concept that everything's equal and humans and animals are the same. He said the sages say that it leads to cruelty. It leads to cruelty towards other human beings because there's no order, there's no sanctity in the human being because animal and human are the same. In the same way we view animals, the same way we view humans. An animal dies over there, a human dies. What's the difference? Right? Why should one be buried? Why not? You know, this whole thing. And he says it could even lead to cannibalism. And so he's saying that consciousness of kind is what created the generation of Noah, right? And the generation of Noah were the most disgusting people in terms of their cruelty and coldness, to the point that God had to literally remove them from the planet Earth. And not only that, even the animals, vegetation, everything. He said man was granted dominion over animals, including the rights to take their lives for man's purpose, in order to impress upon him his spiritual superiority and heightened moral obligations. Where man to accord his animals the same rights he accorded fellow man, being that he would rapidly degenerate to the level of animals in assuming that he is bound by the standards of morality no different than those espoused by brute animals. He says in his insightful psychological observation, Rabbi Kook remarks that even individuals who are normally degenerate seek to channel their natural moral instincts in some direction. Frequently, they seek to give more impression to moral drives by becoming particularly scrupulous in regards to some of the significant aspects of moral behavior. With most with most present knowledge of future events, Rav Kook argues that were veganism to become the norm, people might become quite callous with regards to human welfare and human life, and express their incensed moral feelings in a exaggerated concern for animals' welfare. These comments summons the mind and speculate of Germans watching with they're okay with it, while their Jewish neighbors were dispatched to death camps, and immediately therefore turned their attention to the welfare of the house pets that they had left behind. So he's interested. He says when the Jews were removed and sent to gas chambers, he says the Germans, they didn't care about the Jews, they cared about the animals. Despite foregoing veganism is not rejected by Judaism as a valid lifestyle, for it has some individual for at least for some individuals, there are to be sure individuals who are imposed by the prospect of consuming flesh, or repulsed by the prospect of consuming flesh of the living creature. It is not the case that individuals who decline to partake to meat is whatever, is guilty of some type of moral code. On contrary, the scripture states that you will say, I will eat meat because our souls desire to eat meat. With all the desire of your soul, you may eat meat. Deuteronomy is explicit. The implication is that the meat may be consumed when there is a desire and appetite for it to be as food, but may it be eschewed when there is no desire and I guess forgery that was found to be repugnant. The question is one of is one is the question is one of perspective. Concerns only arise when such conduct is elevated to the level of a moral norm. He says the ethics The ethicists who do not accept the notion of revelation are left with a problem in with regards of the nature of ethical uh, uh, propositions. Propositions. Ethical statements are nearly more than an expression of subjects' likes or dislikes, since a man has no difficulty in distinguishing between the expression of mere preference and the expression of what he regards as moral norm. C.L. Stevenson's drew a distinction in essentially the following manner. The statement "I like spinach" is a reflected of a subject feeling and nothing more. The proposition X is good, resolving into statements. I approve of X, and you shall, and you do, and he says, you do so as well. The proposition X is good, goes beyond the go against a proposition is like spinach. It is the address that it is addressed to others and seeks to have them adopt the attitude of the speaker. So he's saying like this basics of like people liking things, right? And people having preferences. I like this, I don't like this, right? And then the person says, I don't like this, and then they have their own likes, but then they apply maybe a ethical reason to it. And then they seek to impose that thought on other people, right? Because they've created a logic around it. This is an individual subjected repugnance at the prospect of consuming flesh of an animal is a specific response rather than the moral reaction. It becomes a moral position only when expressed in advocating the adoption of such a norm as conduct for others as well. Jewish tradition does not command carnivorous behavior. It rejects the notion that, at least during the current historical epoch, the reunification of eating of meat should be proposed as a moral ideal for mankind. Although moral veganism finds no support in Jewish ethics, he said it's not esoteric, but veganism is not incompatible with Jewish teachings. Anyways, a few words fucked me up, but the point is like this. As we said it earlier, the issue is here, right? The issue is that the ideology of veganism, that some people who don't believe in God are not going to accept our viewpoint. And it becomes a mechanism that is now forced upon you as many other social ideas, right? And then from those particular social ideas, they become these movements, right? And these movements have no spiritual basis, they have no connection to God. And so that idea is not something we are about in Judaism. However, if someone has a vegan diet and it's healthier for them, or they have something about eating animals just does not work for them, I mean, fine, whatever. But it's a personal thing. It's not an ideology that other people need to bring on. He says meat. Okay, so now we're going to the next topic, okay, which is meat on Yom Tov. One halakhic consideration standing in the way of the adherence of a strict vegan regimen is the obligation of Simcha Yom Tov, rejoicing in the festivals. According to most authorities, throughout the period which the temple stood, there was an absolute obligation, at least for a part of males, to partake in the flesh of the festival offering. He says Rav Judah Ben Batanir declares during the time of the temple existence, there was no rejoicing other than with meat. As it said, you shall slaughter your peace offering and you should eat it there. And you should rejoice before the Lord, your God, says in that. He said, the just opposed in a single verse of the commandment concerning the peace offering and the obligation regarding rejoicing is regarded by the Gemara as establishing a principle that rejoicing in the festival that explicitly commands in Deuteronomy is the partaking of meat and sacrifices. Right? So that's so they're saying during the times of the temple, times of Beis Hamikdash, people during the Yom Tov would rejoice with meat. It was a big part. Basar was a big part. Subsequent to the destruction of the temple, the consequence lapse of sacrifice or order, or whether or whether or not there exists an obligation to partake of ordinary meat on the festivals is a matter of some dispute. There would appear to be no basis for assuming that such an obligation exists, since the obligation possessed by the Gemara explicitly specifies that the meat of the festival's offering must be used for this purpose. Indeed, the statement of Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Huda concluded with the remarks: now that the temple does not exist, there is no rejoicing other than with wine. As it is written, wine it gladdens a person's heart. He said the implications of this statement is that the subsequent to the destruction of the temple, the commandment concerning rejoicing of the festival is fulfilled only with the drinking wine, not by eating the meat. Similarly, the Gemara in Pesakim indicates that even while the temple stood, there was sacrificed meat should not be cooked on the Sabbath. The obligation of rejoicing was sacrificed by the domain clean remained in drinking old wine, rather than by eating ordinary wine prepared in advance of the Sabbath. This is indeed the position of the Ritva. And he says, Rishonim. He says in Kedushin and in the Chuvot of the Rashba. And he says, who maintains that there is no longer exists an obligation to partake of meat of the festivals. Moreover, Tosfos says in Yoma, Yoma, and Rabbi Nissan says in Sukkah, he said, citing the earlier mentioned statement that in Pesakim, in the statement of the Gemara, which speaks to all of the forms of the rejoicing, asserts that even during the temple period, the eating of wine was not absolute requirement. Rav Nissan characterizes the requirement of eating meat, to eat meat of the festivals as a mitzvah minei mavarts. He says an optimal manner of fulfilling the obligation, but not an absolute requirement. It's interesting. He says, however, Rambam and Sefer HaMitzvot, he said he adopts an entirely different position. He includes that his statements that you shall rejoice in the festival, that this is sages said to rejoice in them in various forms of rejoicing, because of this has to do with meat, to drink wine, to do new clothes, and to distribute fruits and sweets to the children and the women. Even more explicit is Rambam's statement in Hilchot Yom Tov. After codifying the requirements of eating the meat of the festival offerings during the days of the temple, Rambam turns to an explicit explanation of another ramification of the commandment to rejoice in the festival. How is the commandment fulfilled? Children are given parched corn, nuts, and sweets for women. One buys beautiful clothes and ornaments in accordance with one's financial ability. The man eats meat and drinks wine, for there is no rejoicing other than with meat, and there is no rejoicing other than with wine. This view is adopted for the Tur, Shulchan Aruch, and Orach Chaim. He said the Beis Yosef questions the requirement posed by Rambam and Tur regarding the eating meat on the festival, since the Gemara seems to indicate that in our time the commandment is satisfied by merely drinking wine. He says the statement in Hagiga. So this is interesting. Okay, so on one side we have this view in the Gemara that says, hey, the requirement of eating meat is great to do it, but it's not an absolute requirement. And with the Torah speaking about in Deuteronomy is in outside of the time of the temple, is the rejoicing he's speaking of is with wine, because wine gladdens a man's heart. He says, He says to include all forms of rejoicing is apparently understood by Rambam as created by a normative obligation beyond the possessed in Pazakim, which regards the partaking of meat of the festival's offering. So Rambam goes even further to what that means. He doesn't just leave it to meat, but he brings wheat, meat, wine, this, giving fruits out, the whole thing, sweets. He says, therefore, maintains Rambam that when meat of sacrificial animals is not available, ordinary meat must be eaten for the purpose of fulfilling the commandment of rejoicing. It is a quite evident that the sages it's quite evident that the sages maintain that the consumption of ordinary meat gives rise to joy, since the Gemara in Sanhedrin declares as forbidden to eat meat or drink on the days of preceding the ninth of Av. This prohibition is later extended to prohibitions of meat beginning with the first day of Av. However, if all appropriate forms of rejoicing are mandatory, why does the Gemara speak of wine as an obligation only in our days, but not when the meat of the festivals or the festival, but not when the meat of the festivals offerings was given? So they're asking a lot of questions here, right? So one point is they're trying to understand what's the MS, right? What are we holding at? There's some that could learn that if they read the Torah, the Peshat, you could understand that eating meat and celebration and being happy is a big part. And there's an idea that during the times of the temple, that's what people used to do. But there's other sages that come in and say, well, actually, during the time of the temple, people ate meat, but it wasn't such a thing. But it was like meat and wine, these types of things. So together, it was a whole concept. He says, but when we came out of the temple, the meat wasn't as much of a requirement for Basar, because maybe the elevation of the time of the Kedusha during the times of the Beis Mikdash are not here. And so the elevation of meat is not the same. So now we get that elevation from the wine. But the issue is in the end, you come with Rambam. Rambam comes and he says, no. He says the rejoicing of time is eating meat for sure, even outside of the temple. Drinks this, and he goes even further, right? And so we're trying to understand what is the obligation. And then he brings up things like, well, if it's just meat about rejoicing, or if it's just wine, why is it that meat and wine are things that we can't have during the 9 days, right? During the month of Av, right? So he's going back and forth and trying to get clarity on this point. So let's keep going. So he says, he suggests that the temple stood rejoicing was possible without the liberation effect of wine, but only in exile is wine necessary. So this is even going even to a different point. He says the wine is only in exile wine is necessary to dispel melancholy and generate joyness in order to restore faith that God has not forsaken us. It says this in Yom Shav. He says the failed to explanation of why the Pesakim speaks to in obligation with regards to drinking old wine prior to the destruction of the temple. He says among later days authorities, Mogav states that the subsequent to the destruction of the temple, there is no obligation to eat meat on a festival. He said the statement is, however, contradicted by other commentaries of Mogen Abraham himself and in the Orach Chaim. He says cites a similar statement in the name of Levesh, declaring that the eating of meat on the festivals not to be obligatory in our day, and pointing to the Sanhedrin declares Levush is to be an error. And yet another comment, Rav in the Magen Abraham declares that it to be a mitzvah to eat meat on Yom Tov. So it's not. So we just heard at first we thought wine for sure was in. And then we're hearing that no, wine is not maybe such a thing automatic is a fulfillment of that either. One ramification of view is that the eating of meat on the festivals is absolute requirement. Is found in the tshuva Havot and the Arv. So he says, Yair. And he says, in the sole ritual slaughtering of the small village fell ill prior to Passover, with the result that the townspeople were faced with the prospect of being without meat for holidays. He says one of the members of the community was proficient in the laws of slaughtering and did not possess formal Kabbalah rabbinical license to serve as a ritual slaughter. And the Havot Yair, he says, ruled that there was no question in regards to the actual kashrut of the slaughtering animals. The requirement for the Kabbalah must be waived in order to make it possible to fulfill the commandment of rejoicing in the festival. So this is a whole nother thing. So the whole situation where basically they're saying that a guy who didn't necessarily have a smicha in shechting, and kashrus, was able to do it for his community because they wanted to fulfill this mitzvah of rejoicing, and they connected it to the eating of the meat. So he says, in contrast to this ruling is the grounds that, according to many authorities, subsequent to the destruction of the temple, the eating of the meat of on Yom Tov is not an absolute requirement. The later views also positioned and cited he's bringing different sources that is citing another matter. He says another matter that is directly is definitely contingent of upon the resolution of this question is addressed by Rav Moshe Halevi Steinberg. He writes in Hakata, I don't know, Hakata Hager Kuntras Hatushuva. He said the question concerns the conversion of the conversion of a proselyte, a convert, who is a vegetarian and hence will not assume the obligation to eat meat on Yom Tov. If such a consumption of meat is an absolute obligation, the conversion is invalid. Ooh. This conclusion follows the principle formulated in Brachot 13b, the Masechet Brachot, and in the Mechilat Parsha for Kiddushin, Kadoshim. And he says, which provides that the candidate failure to accept any provision of Jewish law invalidates a conversion. If, on another hand, the eating of the meat on Yom Tov is not normative requirement, the conversion is entirely valid. So that's a big issue. So if you're saying that the meat is required, say a person wants to convert, right? They want to convert to Judaism, say, hey, I want to keep the Torah. And he says, okay, well, you got to eat meat. He says, but I'm a vegan. So if you hold that meat is not an obligation, okay, he's converted. But if you're saying it is an obligation, then he cannot convert. He says, regardless of whether or not the existence of normal obligation to eat meat on Yom Tov is certain, that a sage encourages and urges the same practice, even practices which are not mandated by the obligations concerning rejoicing, nevertheless consults a fulfillment of commandment when they result in feelings of gladness and joy. In forbidding the eating of the meat on the day preceding of the ninth of Av, because the consumption might gives rise to joy, the Gemara forbids the sighting of the types of meats comparable to that of the sacrificed animal. Thus, fowl and preserved meats are not included in this prohibition. Interesting. And he says, and they follow that according to Rambam, who requires the eating of meat on Yom Tov, that it is the meat of animals rather than a fowl which could be eaten. So now they're differentiating different types of basar, right? It's important. We could go into that another time. Nevertheless, the Gemara in Beitza explains that droves slaughtered on Yom Tov must be designated for the purpose in advance. Less if the drove was explains that the doves slaughtered on Yom Tov must be slaughtered for the purpose in advance. Lest the dove may not be previously examined and be found on Yom Tov to be insufficiently fattened, which results in that a person relying upon them for Yom Tov meat will be lacking in the joy. Since even according to the Rambam, the obligation commandment of rejoicing cannot be fulfilled by eating doves, and it's clear that its absence a normative obligation Is normative obligation. The sages sought to promote the eating of tasty meats on a Yom Tov because the consumption of food enhances the joyfulness and festivities of the day. Thus, even if there is no normative obligation to partake of meat on Yom Tov, abstaining from meat on Yom Tov because of the considerations of veganism will not have been looked upon with favor by the sages. Okay, so we finished that. And so the thing is like this. It's a very interesting thing, and there's a lot of details to it, especially the idea of the different types of basar leading up to the 9 days and what's considered, acceptable and what's considered not. But the main thing is like this. Ideologically, we believe in the order of creation that starts with the human kingdom, animal kingdom, plant kingdom, and rock kingdom, right? And the reverse applies, right? And the top of that kingdom is man, right? Man was given dominion all over our creation, and that's why we have bechira. That's why we have free will, and then that's why we have these obligations. That's why we have these obligations to live in accordance to God's will, right? Because we have this dominion, right? So to protect humanity, and I think Rabbi Hirsch brings this out in his book, Horeb, the idea that we have this as a reminder of our responsibility. Shabbat is a time that we remind ourselves of our place in humanity, right? And what our role is and our responsibility. And we renew those vows and those commitments to all of creation by not working, by not serving, right? So that's when people don't keep Shabbat. It's not just, oh, well, I don't keep Shabbat or I have my own way of doing it. It's that the mechanism of being able to see the role that we play in humanity and our job in humanity, right? Our job in humanity, right? And how we fulfill that job is through the keeping of the Torah as is designed by the sages of our generation, right? Not conservative sages or reform sages or no, people who hold by the Gemara, hold by the Mishnayot, right? Who hold by the Rishonim, by the Tanaim, the Amoraim. These are our bodies of how we survive in the Galut until we come back with Mashiach ruling over us inside of Eretz Israel, right? So until we have that, so ideologically we believe in that order. So we do not believe animals and humans are in the same level or even close to it. We don't believe that we have an obligation to treat animals, in any way like human beings, or we should not eat them and elevate them, because there's a whole concept kabbalistically of elevating the soul of the animal to a human level, in a plant to an animal level, in a rock to a plant level, all this whole thing. So we believe in elevating the souls, even the souls of the animals, as we eat them. And as it relates to Yom Tov, it's not so clear. It's not so clear. It's not so clear to say you have to have meat on Yom Tov or not. Some people hold that it's wine. Some people hold it's meat and wine. Some people hold it's meat. Some people say wine is not. So it's open. You should consult with your local Orthodox rabbi. But the point is, we're starting off this new week, this new life, this new beginning. We're thinking about the base principles of being a Jew, our relationship with the world, our relationship with secular ideas, and how we became who we are as human beings, from the standpoint of how we shifted, how we understand food.